After the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 requiring integration of all public schools, schools faced serious conflict of not wanting to let students of color to attend, but finally compromised on letting 9 students of color to attend. These 9 were the first students integrated into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas through the 1957 to 1958 school year, facing violence and protests throughout. With the help of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who refused to compromise with the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, President Eisenhower sent 1,200 of the 101st Army Airborne Unit to protect the students as they attempted to integrate. In 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson case made the separate but equal policy, which kept students in separate schools all over the United States. This led to lots of segregation in the 1900s. Examples were when Melba was very young, she had an infection and had to go to the hospital. They treated her poorly and told her to give it time when her temperature was 106 degrees. And how in Little Rock the houses were separated in blocks of whites and blocks of people of color. Even though these are smaller events, this was happening all over the United States, and it was also very segregated in the schools. Even though the 14th Amendment says that everyone has equal rights, the schools for people of color were very small and dirty, with mold and very little supplies, while white schools were big and clean. Also, white schools were given much more money, and schools for people of color were given very little. The Brown v. Board of Education court case made in 1954 because of Oliver Brown's daughter Martha Brown being treated terribly in schools, allowed the schools to be integrated. 13 parents, including Oliver Brown, were involved in the case, along with Thurgood Marshall, head of the NAACP Legal Defense, National Association for Advancement of Colored People. This case was combined with 3 others to create the Brown v. Board case. Oliver Brown used the 14th Amendment to his side of the argument. On May 17, 1954, the court decided that the schools were inherently unequal and that the goal was to integrate the schools with all deliberate speed.
And at the time that it was implemented, they had the clause in there with all deliberate speed, which meant that they could do it whenever they wanted to.
Once schools weren't integrating, the government decided to take away all of their funds if they didn't integrate. They were originally going to integrate the elementary school, but the parents were so racist and threatening that they decided to just integrate the high school instead. The Little Rock 9 tried multiple times to get into the school and could not once get in. They almost had to sacrifice one of the students so the rest could get out. The integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to 1958 was a very challenging event to complete. Since the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, called in 1,000 fully armed National Guard troops on September 2, 1957 to prevent the students from integrating. He said in a newspaper interview that he thought the integration would cause the students to become violent and it would disturb their learning. President Dwight D. Eisenhower demanded Orville Faubus to remove his troops. In an executive order, he sent 1,200 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Unit on September 4th to protect the students from protesters during the integration.
We met with 7 of the 9 this weekend inside the school library at the building they fought to enter 50 years ago, Little Rock Central. Elizabeth, yours is the face that people have frozen in their minds. Your incredible self-possession, your not talking back, you're not reacting, you're just trying to go to school.
I was in shock because I thought the soldiers were there to protect all students. It was after the 3rd attempt to get into school that I was turned away to these angry people. And I had been taught to look to adults for help, and I did. But the woman I thought was kind spat on me. So it was such a shocking, terrifying event that seemed to last a very long time before I could get away.
The students who were selected by President of the Arkansas National Association for Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Daisy Bates were Minnie Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patillo, Gloria Ray, Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, and Carletta Walls. They finally entered on September 25th after multiple failed attempts because of the violent protesters. For example, in one case, the protesters beat 4 colored reporters. During the school year, the students were beaten and called very insulting racial slurs.
And why did you come out of school?
Because I'm not going to school with niggers.
Uh-huh. And do you feel that the majority agree with you, or with the...
The majority of people here in Arkansas agree with me.
Well, what are you going to do for an education?
Well, St. Mary's isn't integrated. We can go there, we can go to a private school. Even if there's enough girls that want to, we can go to Tech High, and there won't be any niggers come out there.
Though it was extremely hard for the students, Ernest Green became the first person of color to graduate on May 25, 1958. In September of 1958, Governor Orville Faubus closed all Little Rock schools because of a vote to prevent the integration called the Southern Manifesto, signed by 19 United States senators and 51 congressmen. President Eisenhower reopened the schools in August of 1959. Because of these rights that people of color were receiving, it led to lots of protests and threats towards them, and it led to the awareness of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists, and led to many other schools being integrated, as this was only the beginning of the public school integration plan. This event overturned the separate but equal policy in 1957, and in 1960 the event led to 2% of students of color integrated into public schools. Years later, the population grew to 45% of children integrated. The Little Rock 9 integration has changed segregation in schools forever by helping children of color receive a better education. Though some schools have not been affected by a Little Rock 9 integration as much, a study in 2010 showed that a school of 58% white children was much nicer and higher tech, while a school of 78% children of color was falling apart with parts of it being closed to mold and water damage. The use of technology and documentation helped raise awareness of the problem to people like Martin Luther King Jr., which made this event have an even greater impact. Even after Little Rock 9 went to school, there were many schools that were still segregated, but the Little Rock 9 inspired other kids to go to a white-only school and to segregate the schools.
From the vantage point of today and the role that high school students and young people are playing today in trying to get reform legislation passed about guns and violence, it was really young people who pushed the civil rights movement forward. And so it was the bravery of these kids in Little Rock to stand up to abuse and hostility that inspired both other young people and older people to get involved in the civil rights movement.
After the Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, requiring integration in all public schools, schools faced serious conflict. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 children of color were integrated into an all-white high school, facing violence and protests during the 1957 school year. With the help of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who refused to compromise with the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, he sent 1,200 troops to protect the students as they integrated.
But when I got a little older, I realized that they had a lot more courage than I would have ever had. To know that you're going into a situation facing certain danger, and yet, their faith led them to stand on the higher moral ground and to accomplish, what they did without, they had fear, but their courage and their commitment overcame the fear, and so I don't know if I could have done that.
This movement has changed our schooling and our daily lives, showing people that using peaceful protest can always affect our world for the better.
It was the early civil rights movement itself that demonstrated to people that you can take a stand,